So since we started Applitools, like over the last few years, I met with a lot of companies all over the place from different verticals, and one of the things that is I see repeating is like a lot of people are struggling with how to test responsive websites. I mean, in the past you had a challenge, okay, you had to test a website on different browsers and different environments, but now you also need to deal with all different screen sizes and configurations, and the website might appear differently, so it's not just about writing code that can run on any browser. Now you also need to worry about the different layouts. So in this talk we'll just try to cover exactly that topic. And we're basically going to start by getting some sort of alignment on the definition on what is responsive web design. We'll go over some example of how to test the GitHub website. GitHub website is a pretty good example of a good responsive site. And then we'll go over some best practices or tips for interacting with a responsive website using your automation code. We'll go over validation tips. So as you know, in testing there is also interaction and validation, so we'll split these. And if we have time at the end, we also cover some scalability tips. And I would like to try to keep it interactive, so I don't want to like just do Q&A at the end. If you have any questions, feel free to just ask while we're going. So let's start. So just to define the definition of responsive web design, this is actually taken from Wikipedia. So responsive web design is an approach to web design aimed at crafting sites to provide an optimal viewing experience and interaction experience across a wide range of devices. Which basically means make sure that your site looks right on any, I mean, if I access it from my phone or from my laptop or from my iPad, I'll get an optimal viewing experience. So if I open it on a wide screen, I'll be able to see all the information. If I open it on a mobile device where I don't have the same real estate, I'll only see the information which is important, and things might get aligned differently. If on the desktop things align horizontally, on the mobile it might be aligned vertically. And just to show you some examples, so I took here two examples. One of the github.com website, which we're going to use for a lot of the examples today. So let's just open it. By the way, for some reason the recording stopped. I hope it's okay. So this is the GitHub website, and as you can see, when I open it in a wide view, I see the entire website. I see a form here to do sign up. I have the menus on the top where I can go to the features page, the business page, explore page. But if I'm going to start narrowing the page, I have the Warriors game going here in the background. So if I'm going to start narrowing the page, then you will see that like the top menu here is replaced with a hamburger menu. So if I want to go to the features page, I need to first click on the hamburger menu. And also the general layout of the page changes as the page size changes. If I change it to like even an error view, you can see that like even the sign up form is no longer here. It just adapts and it shows the right structure. So this is a pretty good example of a page that behaves nice as a responsive site. And if we take a different example, let's go to the, I think the other example here is Wikipedia. And we're just looking at about the definition of responsive web design. So this is the Wikipedia page defining what responsive web design is. And if we try to minimize it, you will see that it doesn't really behave nicely, and I don't even see the definition now. So this is an example of a page that doesn't really do a good job as a responsive website. But what's really important okay, let's just skip this slide. So what's really important to consider when building tests for a responsive website is generally the window.innerWidth is the main factor which defines the behavior of the site. So when you write your website code, a CSS code, this basically defines the breakpoints and at which point it will change from one layout to another layout to a different layout. And so we're going to see some examples of how to actually deal with the window.innerWidth. But what's important to also mention here, and we're going to drill down to it later, is there is a difference between setting the browser window size, like you do with Selenium, with the window set size, versus actually setting the inner size of the viewport, which is like the equivalent to the window inner width. And it's really important to actually take into consideration the inner width of the window, because this is how the breakpoints actually appear in your code, and not just look at the browser window, because there might be some differences. And if you actually want your test to be accurate, you need to take that into consideration. But we'll see more about it later in the talk. So every test, as you know, is constructed from interaction and validation. First, you interact with the application under test. navigate between the different pages, and then you deal with the validation. We'll start by seeing some examples of how to interact with a responsive website using Selenium, and then we'll cover the validation part. And for this example, we basically used some example that was written in Java with JUnit and Selenium, just because it's the Selenium Meetup. And let's just go ahead and start testing. So I'll try resizing the code so that it's not too small. Let's see. Cool. Can you see the code in the back?
Yeah.
Great. So let's start with a really simple example of building a test on the GitHub website. And in this case, I took a really basic test. I mean, in the setup, I just initialized the Chrome driver. In the teardown, I just quit the driver, which is pretty basic. And in the test itself, the only thing I'm doing is I'm just opening I'm setting the size of the window. In this case, I'm using Selenium. We'll explain later why it's not such a good idea, but I'm just setting it to 1,000 width and 600 height. By the way, the height doesn't really make a difference. Usually it's just about the width. And I just opened the github.com website and I click on two different links. In this case, I just took the CSS selector of the features link on the top and the explore link. So just the features link was the first child, and the, let's see. Yeah, this was the first child and the explore link was the third child, but it's a really basic code. As you can see, we just open these two pages. Let's just run this test really quick. I guess nothing new so far for you guys. So let's just go ahead and run it. And when I run the test, it's just going to open Chrome, hopefully. Yeah. And then it opens the github.com website, clicks on the features link, and clicks on the exploring. Wow, amazing. So this is an example of a test. But now if I'm going to change it to, instead of 1,000, actually run it on a 400 width, which is more like a mobile device size, let's just go and run the test again. In this case, it opens the browser again. But now I see that the test raised an exception. Let's see why it raised an exception. So you can see here that I have an exception element not visible. And this happened here in this line. So, sorry, in this line. So when it tried to actually click on the features link, the link was not visible. Because if we go back to the GitHub page, if we minimize the view here, when the hamburger menu appears, you can see that actually by default it's closed, so I have to click on it in order to be able to click on the features link. So even though it's the same selector for the features link in the narrow view and in the broader view, still in order to be able to, I mean, Selenium doesn't click on invisible elements, so in order to be able to click on the element, I have to first click on the hamburger menu and only then click on the features link. So let's go back to the test code and see what's the right way to make it work. And of course, I don't want to write like different code for each layout. We'll touch on that later. So let's just take an example of a code to address it. So, so in this case, what I need to actually do is like when I open the page, I need to actually check in which layout I'm at. Like if I'm in the narrow layout where I need to first click on the button and then click on the features link, or if I'm in the broader layout where I can just directly click on the features link. So what I'm actually going to do here, it's pretty much the same code that you've seen before. So we just open github.com, but in this case what we do is just detect the navigation menu, like the hamburger menu, and we check if this hamburger menu is displayed. If it's displayed, we first click on it and then click on the features link or explore link or whatever. If it's not displayed, we just go ahead and directly click on the features link. So this is like sort of nice code that basically allows me to interact with the page, and I don't have like specific code to deal with each type of page. I just have one test which can run on these different layouts. But I'm pretty sure that you all don't really like this code style because something is really wrong here. Because like all the page implementation details are actually embedded in the test code, which is a very bad practice, because if I have 100 tests that are working on the same page, if the page changes, I'll need to go and update 100 tests, which is, of course, something that I don't want to do. So the solution for that is actually to use page objects. If I actually take all the page implementation details and embed it in the page object, that's a better practice to actually make my test easier to maintain. By the way, any questions so far, just to make sure I'm not running too fast? So far it was pretty basic, but just want to make sure that you're following.
I have a question. I said, height doesn't
Yeah, the height does matter. Yeah.
See, some of the pages don't scroll, so you cannot scroll by default. And its height doesn't matter what all user will expect, because you cannot see the bottom of.
Oh, okay. So we'll touch on the height and how to scroll the page and capture the full screen.
Some of the browsers, they have them by default, non-scroll, so you have to actually code. So if you shrink it, it will extend, but you cannot see the bottom.
That's a good question. We'll touch about like scrolling and capturing the full page later on when we see the validation part, but it's a good point. I mean, the height does matter. I just meant that it doesn't matter for the responsive layout. So if you open the page in a different height, it won't change the page appearance, but it does matter and you do need to check it. So that's a good point, but we'll touch on it later.
A stupid question here. You have the nav menu, you have these things repeated, find element by.
Yeah. So, okay, yeah, so we'll get to that now. I mean, this is just a basic example just to show, but now we're going to make it nicer code. So, okay, so now let's go and see how this would look like in a more, in a better design, I would say. So again, the setup and the turndown stays pretty much the same. By the way, let me just zoom in so you guys in the back can see it as well. But after I design it with page objects, actually the test itself is going to look much nicer. I just open github.com page. I basically set up the homepage page object. And then I just basically, the homepage have a method to go to the features page, which returns a features page. And then the features page knows to go to the explore page, and this returns the explore page. So this is like a much easier to read the code, and all the implementation details are actually embedded in the page object. So if I go and look at the, if I go and look at the base page, for example, so all the details about all the selectors are like in the page object itself. So I have the selector for the navigation menu, the selector for the features link, and the selector for the explore link. And because like pretty much all the pages have the ability to click on features and click on explore, I can implement all of that in the base page, and then all the other pages will just inherit from the base page. So I don't even need to repeat this implementation for each and every page. So if we look at the base, I mean, the base page constructor simply gets the driver and the name, just a logical name of the page. And then we just have like a method to like click the button, which basically just checks if the hamburger menu exists, the same thing we did before, and then just clicks on the locator that it gets. So if I call like a method go to features page, what we'll just do, we'll just call this method with the features page locator. It will check if the button exists. If it does, it will first click on the button, then click on the link. If it doesn't exist, it will just directly click on the link. And the same with the go to explore page. But as you can see, the code now is much cleaner. And like all the other pages, just extend base page. So I don't need to put any code in the actual pages. But if I'm going to run, and in this case I use the, let's see. So in this case I use the, like the collection of the parameters of like the screen width, so I can run the test. And it will actually, let me just exit this view so it won't mess up. So if I'm going to run the test now, it will actually run. It will open first on the wider view screen. Just navigate, open the different pages. This test finished, and then it will just run again. Open the narrower view, like the mobile view, and finish running. What happened here? Okay, yeah, the test finished. Okay, so yeah, now we're all good. Like the two tests finished running, everything is fine. So any questions on this part of the code before we move on? Okay. So we've seen some examples of like how to interact with a responsive site, and let's cover some of the tips that some of these we went over, but some of the important tips for interacting with responsive websites. So the first tip is that you have to detect the page layout within the page object. So you really should try to avoid detecting the page layout in the test code. You should actually encode it in the page object, and this will actually allow you to write tests that are layout independent and browser independent. So this is an important point. It's also important to avoid creating layout specific page objects. So again, it's just something that I'm seeing a lot of people doing, basically creating different page objects for each layout. So you have like a wide features page and a narrow features page. And generally, when you look at responsive design, this is a bad practice because in responsive websites, in many cases, the locators are the same, regardless of like if you open the page in like the narrow view, you still have the same locator for the features page, you still have the same locator for the explore page. So it doesn't make sense to keep two different page objects for the different sizes. And this is, I mean, there are some other types of layouts like adaptive where like the page is actually presented differently on different sizes and the functionality of the site is also different on the different sizes. So in that case, it might make sense to like maintain different page objects for different layouts, but in responsive design in general, it's a good practice to actually keep one page object for all the different layouts. Another thing that is important is to avoid detecting the layout by the window.innerWidth. So in this case, I could actually, instead of like looking for the hamburger menu and doing this if clause, where like if the menu exists, click on it, and if not, then just click directly on the link. I could actually also do like an if that will just check the size of the window. If the window.innerWidth is over 400, do that, and if it's less than 400, do this. But this is a bad practice because you actually couple between the page implementation and the test code, which is generally a bad practice. And if the page changes, I mean, usually it's better to do it this way. And the last one is actually when you set the browser size. So we touched on it briefly at the beginning. It's better to set the size by the window.innerWidth and not the external size of the window. So just to explain what I mean here, if we go back to the browser. So the browser actually has like the external size, which include like the scroll bars and the frame of the browser, and there is also the viewport, like the inner size of the window. And all the responsive breakpoints are determined according to the inner size of the window, but when you set the size with Selenium, it actually sets the external size of the window. So there are different techniques to set the inner size of the window. If you want to see some code examples, the Applitools SDK is actually open source, and there is a method to set the inner size of the window, so you can just copy this code to your code and use that if you want to set the inner size. But generally speaking, it's better to use like just to set the inner size instead of set the external size. Any questions on the interaction part before we move to covering validation? Yeah.
So you're saying that you want one page object with conditional. So how are you supposed to detect the layout?
So basically, usually depending on the functionality. So if you know that like in a small layout you expect to watch the to have the hamburger page, you can just do an if clause and just see if the hamburger menu.
Conditionals for everything that's different on the same page object rather than subclassing it.
Exactly.
Is there a reason not to subclass it?
The reason not to subclass is because a lot of the locators, a lot of the functionality will be like shared across this.
Go in the superclassing.
Yeah, but it just, I mean, I think just the code will be like a bit cleaner and nicer. So again, it's not that it's like you should not do it, but I think, I mean, I like better this approach. Okay, so let's cover the validation part. So if we go back to the definition of responsive design, so of course an approach of web design, blah, 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 but basically it needs to provide an optimal viewing and interaction experience across a wide range of devices. So the test that we just wrote actually makes sure that I can click on the buttons and I can open the different pages, but it doesn't validate anything. Like if I'll open the page and the page, like everything will be hidden or everything will be overlapping, the test won't find it. So for that, we need to also validate that the page actually looks nice and that it appears correctly in all these different sizes. So this is where the validation comes into play. And the way to actually validate this is using visual testing. So the definition of visual testing is a quality assurance activity aimed to verify that a graphical user interface appears correctly to the user. So as you can see, it's pretty much aligned with what was defined in the responsive web design definition. And just to show you some example of the kind of visual defects that you might face on different form factors or different devices, this is an example from the Twitter native mobile application. On some devices, you can see that the notifications here are like overflowing and some of the text is hidden. This is another example from the UPS iPad application. You can see on an iPad 3 device, the whole delivery information section here is broken, and you can't really see what's going on here. So again, in this case, if I run the test with Selenium, everything is fine. I mean, I can click on the buttons, I can get the text, but just it's not presented correctly to the end user. And again, I have a bunch of other examples. This is from the Financial Times iPad application. Also, the title here overflows the text body. But generally speaking, when speaking about visual testing, the workflow for performing visual testing is pretty simple, and it's pretty consistent across all the different visual testing tools. The idea is that you start by driving the application under test and taking screenshots. And again, in many of the tools, the driving is done by Selenium, and just the visual testing tool will capture the screenshot while the Selenium test is running. And then typically when you run a test for the first time on an application, the first run of the test creates some sort of a baseline. And then every future run of the test is compared against the baseline. And then it shows you any differences that were found between the first run and any additional run. In some cases, these differences might be related to new features or things that you changed in the application. In this case, you will just accept these changes. And in other cases, it might be related to defects or regressions or things that just break. And in this case, you can reject these changes. So that's a general workflow. Any questions on that? Yeah.
How do you apply this to cross-browser testing?
So that's a good question. We actually have this also at the end, but yeah, it's a good question. We have some slides about it. So let's now take the same test and see how we also add the validation part into the same code. But basically, to run the test, all you need to do is, like in the test code itself, let me just try to zoom it in. So it's pretty much the same test code that you've seen before, just, like we have the home page and then go to features page and go to explore page. But now we also added checkpoints. So every time we call eyes check window, this actually takes a full page screenshot of the entire page. It scrolls down, collects the full screenshot, stitch it together, and then validates it against the baseline. So in this case, all we need to do to validate all these 3 pages is just every time we open a page, we call eyes check window, just give like a logical name for the page, and this will validate the page. So we open the first page called check window, open the second page called check window again, and open the third page and call check window for the last time. We don't change anything in the page object implementation. And as you can see, it's a pretty clean way to implement it. And if I run the test now, in addition to just running and opening the pages, it will also scroll the page down, capture the screenshot, and then it will give me a visual result that will show me the differences between the baseline and the actual. So in this case, I'll save you the time to run the test, but we'll just go to the results. So in this case, I ran the test. Let's just go to the list. So I ran the test in 2 sizes, like in 1000 on 600 and then 400 on 600. These are the 2 layouts that I use, the mobile layout and the desktop layout. And I can immediately see the results. I can see if I open the different steps, I can immediately see like a side-by-side view showing me like the baseline and the actual result. In this case here, nothing changed. But again, I don't want to go through like too much details here, but what's nice about it, it just immediately shows you any changes between the previous run and the current run. So it's like really easy to add these validations, and then you can just have visual coverage, look and feel coverage as part of your responsive test code. And now let's go over some tips for the, yeah.
So that check view?
Check window.
Check window, is that, did you show us the code in check window?
So, okay, so CheckWindow is like part of the Applitools SDK. So it's a framework for visual testing. So when you call CheckWindow, it deals with like scrolling down, capturing a screenshot, dealing with getting the full page screenshot, and doing the image validation or the image checking.
And is there some way in that to exclude regions?
Yeah, so I'll cover that in the scalabilities. But yeah, that's a great question. So you can exclude regions, you can define what level of validation you would like to check and other stuff. Cool. Okay, so let's go over the validation tips. So the first tip is to prefer full page validation. I think it's pretty obvious, but typically when you run the test, and in Selenium there was a big debate whether it makes sense for, in Selenium we have the get screenshot method, and there was a big debate whether it makes sense that the get screenshot will get a full page screenshot like Firefox used to do in the past, versus the viewport screenshot, which was what's coming in Chrome and Safari and the other browsers. And unfortunately, the decision was to take just a viewport screenshot, but again, we will not get to the reasons. But basically, when you take just a viewport, you don't see like everything that is below the fold. So again, you mentioned earlier, you have to validate stuff that is below the fold. So it's really important to capture a full page screenshot. So some open source libraries that allow you to do it, our SDK also allow you to do it. So when you run the test, it's recommended to enable full page screenshot and actually check the entire page and not just the visible viewport. Another important point is to focus on the lower layout boundaries. So again, every lesson that you learn about testing is like you have to focus on the boundaries. This is where like the bugs are most likely to be. And in this case, I mean, of course, if you can check like all the breakpoints, that's ideal. But if you don't have time or resources to check all the boundaries, so it's recommended to focus on the lower boundaries, because typically in the smaller sizes of the page, this is where it's most likely for bugs to happen, like things get overflowing or misaligned or not viewing properly. So if you don't have the capacity to check everything, focus on the lower boundaries. This is also, again, some people might disagree on this one, but I don't think it's a good idea to abort your test on validation failures. So again, some people just say, you know, every time there is a failure in the test, I want to abort it because I just want to keep going and I want like to immediately analyze it. But actually, I think it's a good practice to keep going even when the test encounters some sort of failures, because in many cases, this might expose other failures later down the road, which you can avoid if you just detect it right away and you can fix both issues. And also when you look at visual testing, when you actually capture the baseline, when the test keeps going, it will keep getting additional screenshots of additional pages. And if the application updated, you can actually use this as an opportunity to update the baseline, which helps. And the last two tips are like just to use real browsers and prefer real devices. So again, sometimes it's easier to test with headless browsers, and generally I think it's a good idea whenever you can. But when looking at responsive design tests, I think it's a better practice to use a real browser, just because headless browser doesn't always behave the same when looking at the responsive sites. And of course, with mobile devices, it's the same. I mean, emulator is great for some of the functionality tests, but when you look at the visual test, typically it's better to use real devices when possible. Any questions on this side before we go to the scalability tips? Okay, cool. So, so in this section, I'll just try to cover some tips for scaling your visual tests. So if you start applying visual tests and you want to be successful in scaling it up, I hope that these tips will help. But I think that the first tip is to use a robust image comparison engine and don't rely on bitmap comparison. I think this is like an important point, because in the past there are still a lot of tools that allow you to capture screenshots of the application under test and just compare it in a pixel-to-pixel level with some thresholds. But typically pages don't tend to render consistently, especially if you run on different machines in your lab. But even if you run on the same machine, there might be some rendering differences. And just to show you some examples, so what you can see here, this is like a part of a screenshot in a normal size, and we just zoomed into this part. So this is what you can see in the larger screenshot. And if I toggle between two screenshots from two different computers, can you see the pixel differences? So again, it's not a bug, and the end user will not be able to see it in a normal zoom level, but it's a pretty major change in the pixels. So if you run a test that relies on pixel matching, again, you can set a threshold, but then you will need to start putting high thresholds. And if you put even a 5% threshold on a long page, even if the checkout button will be missing, you might miss it just because this threshold bypasses this. And we have a bunch of other examples here, but it's pretty much the same idea. And when you deal with images, this is where you see the biggest issues. Like in this case, this is the normal size image, and this is the zoom into this part. And if I toggle, probably like 40% of the pixels are different, but it still looks exactly the same. So it's important not to rely on pixel matching, because you can't really afford that your test will fail because of small pixel offsets that the end user cannot see. You also need to be able to deal with dynamic content. So again, there are some questions about it before. We'll see it in the examples. Shifting elements, images of different sizes, and also performance is an important point, because your page might not render exactly at the same time. So you have to make sure that when you capture the screenshots for your visual test, you have to make sure that the screenshot is actually stable and fully rendered. So your visual testing framework needs to deal with making sure that the page is ready to be tested. And of course, the most frightening thing is like if you try to compare two identical images and you get a mismatch. But we'll get to the demo later, but let's move on to the next tip. So the next one is actually related to the question that was asked earlier about how to test different browsers. So the idea here is that it's recommended to use a single baseline for the different browsers, because if you need to start maintaining different baselines for each and every browser, this can be pretty intense. And the idea here is that you start by picking one golden browser, like a master browser, where you run like all your tests in like regression mode. So every time you have a new build, you're just going to run it first on this browser and basically form a baseline for the new version for this specific browser. So let's say that we take Chrome as our main browser. As part of our CI, every time we have a new build, we're just going to run it and compare between the last version and the new version on Chrome and just detect any changes, like anything that changed. I want to know about it and I want to detect it. But then once I approve the baseline for the new version on Chrome, now I can use Chrome, like let's say now it's version 2. So now I can use the baseline for Chrome version 2 to compare against Firefox and Safari and IE, but using the same baseline, just cover all the browsers. And we'll see some demos of how this can be done. No, let's actually see now a demo of how this can be done. So in this case, I'm going to take a test. Okay, let's take this one. So what I did here, I ran a test on the Paychex website, and I ran it initially on Chrome to get the baseline for Chrome, and then I ran it on IE. So you can see it side by side here. The baseline is from Chrome, the actual is from IE. And when I put it side by side, it seems pretty consistent. I mean, again, it doesn't look exactly the same, but it seems pretty consistent. And even if I put it one on top of the other, you can have a display. Let's just zoom in a bit. So I can toggle between the two views of Chrome and IE. And you can see that, again, it doesn't look exactly the same, but still, these are like reasonable changes that happen when you switch browsers. But when I run the test, I still see that in this case, the test failed. And if I highlight the differences, there is some sort of a change here at the bottom of the page. So I can just go ahead and zoom into the change, and then just toggle between Chrome and IE. So you will see that like the text and the frame of the button are missing on IE. So these are typical issues that happen when you run on different browsers, and this will actually help you focus on these issues. So the fact that these different browsers render the text differently and that the lines break in a different way, that's fine as long as it looks okay. But if a button is missing, if a text is overflowing, that's an issue that you want to know about. Does this make sense? Cool. Let's get back here. So the next tip, which is important, is that like the process of maintaining the visual testing baseline should try to make it codeless. Because in many cases, you would want other people in the team to be involved in it. Some people from the graphic design team sometimes need to give their opinion about the baseline changes. Some people from the product team, some people from the QA team, which might not have access to coding. So it's really important to try to make it in a way that like anyone can just see the changes, accept or reject the changes, without needing to take a look at the code and change the code and to maintain the test. So we'll get to that in the examples. But the next tip, which is the next two tips are actually pretty much combined, is first you need to maintain the test on the suite level. So if you have a lot of different tests running on different like screen layouts and browsers and environments, you don't want to like accept changes on each and every page. I mean, if you now have a responsive site that you're testing on 3 different layouts and 3 different browsers, you have like a matrix of 9, and now you change the header of the site. You don't want to go and start updating 9 baseline. It's just going to take a lot of time. So you have to have a way to basically maintain it across the board. And also, you need to be able to automate your maintenance. So let's go and see how this is done. So let's take the GitHub website as an example. What we did here, we took a suite of 19 different tests that were running on 4 different browsers and 4 different screen sizes to check the GitHub website. And I can see that I have 76 mismatches that were detected here. So if I'm going to go and look at the issues that were found, I can start and highlight the issues in the different pages. I can also quickly zoom in to see what actually changed. So in this case, the GitHub logo changed color, which is fine. Maybe it's a desired behavior, so I can accept it. But now if I go and highlight the issues, it seems to be potentially the same change in the logo in all the pages. And again, I don't really want to go over 76 issues one by one. So what I can do here, I have this way to just automate the maintenance as we discussed. And this will actually automate going over all the images and try to figure out if it's the same change and only find unique changes. So it will basically group together all the different changes, and it will only show me unique groups of changes, so that I don't need to go and accept the same change over and over again. So someone actually in the back is now trying to figure out the grouping, so it takes a little bit of time. But once it will finish running, it will basically do the grouping. And then, okay, so now it's done. And I can see that like 36 images were grouped together here, and then 40 images were grouped together. It seems to be the same issue, but let's see what's the difference. So in this case, I have the color change that we've seen before, so I can accept it. This was the desired change. But here, I have, let's see what happened here. So here actually the logo disappeared. So instead of changing the color, the logo disappeared. So I don't want to accept it. I want to reject it and open a defect. So I have an easy way to go and report a defect about it and do what I need to do. But this just shows you how easy it is to analyze results at a larger scale. And there are questions earlier about being able to ignore areas. So you can also just, let's say that I want to ignore this change. I can just go ahead and define an ignore region and just ignore this change. And there are like a bunch of other options. Again, I don't want to do a full demo here, but just want to show you the idea. Any questions on this part? Yeah.
If you define a region that you want to ignore, but the page layout changes, then what that region means would be different if, I don't know, say like the logo got shifted over to the right-hand side, but you meant to ignore the logo in the future.
Yeah, that's a good question. So actually you have two ways to ignore the region. You can just go and do it in the UI, and then if the page changes, then you need to maintain it. But you also have a way to do it in the code, and you just ignore an element by a CSS selector, and then like even if the element will shift, it will only ignore that element. So you can choose which way you want to do it. Any other questions? Okay. Again, there are some more advanced topics here, like with regards to validation, like how you actually detect that the page is in a different layout and click the different buttons to perform validation. But I think, this is beyond what I was planning to cover today. But let's see if. So I think with that we pretty much wrapped up the talk. Any other? Yeah.
Your screenshot that seems to have to be Ruby. Does the Applitools library have Python libraries?
So yeah, so it supports Java, .NET, Ruby, Python, JavaScript, PHP. It's pretty much like all the common languages. Any other? Yeah.
So your tip one, you mentioned not to use bitmap comparison.
Right.
So how the images are getting compared in this case?
So this is like a proprietary algorithm that we've developed for a long time. It's based on some heuristics to try to determine what changes are going to be visible to a human versus what changes are not going to be noticeable by a human. Some of it is based on like AI, some of it is based just on research and heuristics that have been applied over like millions of images to try to figure out like the changes that matter, if you will. Yeah. Did I cover your previous questions? Just to make sure.
I have one question. You see, you scoop the whole problems, right? 90 problems, you scoop into 2 problems, right? Will create a cycle of repeatance of your problem in the future. If you keep scooping the problem into 2, will you stay in a cycle again and again, doing the same old stuff over and over, if you always scooping the problem into few problems?
So, not sure I understand. Like,
the question is, when you run a test, you have like a 70 or 80 bugs, right?
Right.
And then you press one button and that turns into 2 bugs.
Yeah.
Right. Now you run one test, right? Mm-hmm. And a few months later you forget that you did this, right? Mm-hmm. And you run into the same problem, right? You know that many people go to documentations. Yeah. Right? So yeah. You'll create problem again that you stay in one place and you run regression tests over and over.
Right. So when I grouped the changes, it was basically the same change. So it was not like 36 different bugs. It was one bug that just appeared on 36 screens. So the grouping just allowed me to see, okay, there are like 75 failures here, whatever, but 32 out of these just are because of one bug. So if I fix this bug, it will fix all of them. And then the other 35 are because of the color change, and this color change was by design. So when I accept the first 35, this will just update the baseline, just say, okay, from now on, I change the color to green. Now I expect the baseline, like any future test, to be with the green color.
So
the other ones.
This will not solve your problem.
What's that?
Regression test will not solve your problem because you are okay with that bug.
No, it's not a bug. I mean, I accepted that it's a change. It was done by design. So I accepted the change. It updates the baseline. Then the other thing where the logo was missing, this is a bug. So I report a defect about it. I can report a defect. I'll show you here in a second how you can report a defect. But then I reject this change. So the test will continue to fail until this bug is fixed. I can decide if I want to snooze it. I can say, OK, I reported this bug. It's going to take a week to fix it. So I'm just going to snooze it for a week. But and I can tie it to a Jira ticket, but then only when the bug is fixed, then it will start failing.
Putting something in a log file, something that you did something there.
Yeah.
Beautiful, thank you.
Oh, thanks.
We said accept change. What if that color change was wrong? We could reject that and keep our baseline image, correct?
Yeah, so you can, if it was wrong, you can reject it and report it.
How do you determine the how to group things? Are you using like cosine similarity or something like that? Or?
So it's basically the whole thing is just trying to analyze the structure of the page and basically take these two images and try to basically correlate between the different elements in the page based on the alignment of the elements, images versus text, paragraphs, a lot of different heuristics here, and it will only group things if there is like a very high level of certainty that this is really the same change. So if there is like a doubt, it won't group it and it will ask you to take a look, but if it's very likely to be the same change, then it will do the grouping.
So are you setting up receiving on your tool more than just the image and?
No, it's all based on image processing. We only look at the image, but we just by looking at the image, we try to do some semantic. It's based on image processing. So we just look at the image, we try to analyze the structure of the image, but also based on like past learning of what images looks like and what web pages or mobile pages looks like, and then it just tries to determine the structure of the page, correlate it with another, like with the previous version of the page, and see if there are any differences. And when differences are found, then it can look at like, okay, these are, I don't know, 90 differences. Let's try to figure out which ones are the same change.
How do we deal with branch?
So that's a good question. I'll give you a short answer and we can take it offline and I can explain in more details. But we basically have a way to encode a branch. The SDK supports branches, and you can basically, when you run a test, you can like inherit a copy of the baseline for the local branch. Then you run your test on the local branch. When you can test it and you can play with the baseline. When you're comfortable to commit your code or to push your code, it also pushes the baseline and merges the baseline changes with the master. So it's pretty much the same idea as branching, like as source control, but it's just here in the SD. But we can take it offline. I can show you the full details.
There's a 29-point lead by the Warriors right now.
That's good.
Just want to let you know.
Where do you think this can go in the future? You know, where do you think that you'll take things next? And how far do you think that this can go? How automated can some of this stuff get?
So it's a good question. I think, a big part of it is like improvements on the AI side and making it a lot more smarter. Like, as the more data we get, the smarter the system gets. It's also like a lot of it is also integration with other frameworks. Right now we integrate with like Selenium, Appium, Espresso, XUI, and all that stuff, but also integrate with developer tools. So when you change the React code or the JavaScript code, it'll just immediately simulate like the rendering of the page and show you differences. And there are like a bunch of other things on like being able to like manage changes in an automated way from the code or from the UI. So like lots of stuff that can still be done here. But the idea is really to get it to a point where you can, today we're already, I think our biggest customer runs about 100,000 checks per week, like visual checks per week. And the goal is to get to a point where like the false positive ratio is like minimal, because when you run this volume, even like 0.5% is still very high. So the goal is to minimum. And of course, there is no 100% here, but it's the idea is to get it as close as possible to 100%, so that if you want to run in continuous delivery, you can do it. And today, I think like our biggest consumers are people that are doing continuous delivery and doing multiple deployments per day. This is where you see most of the value.
For your web GUI, do you offer plugins? Any type of developer plugins to have on top of it?
Yeah, so one of the things we're doing now is a plugin for GitHub. So like every time you change the code, you'll be able to, like the same thing you do, the diff of the code, you will see the diff of the images and how the page would look like if you changed it.
Like more like add functionality to your GUI?
No. That's
Here or something?
No, it's just like if I wanted to implement I use like a lot of engine, but add some extra maybe interface or something like that.
So if you want to implement additional UI on the page, yeah, no, this is not it.
I missed earlier you went into detail and saying you shouldn't just compare bitmaps and you showed us the pixel changes.
Yeah.
And then you showed us the visual comparisons. What were those if they weren't bitmaps?
So what it does, I mean, it's, I mean, the bitmap is like the traditional way to do it and how like most solutions are doing it. This is, it's based on a lot of image processing stuff, which basically looks at the image, analyzes the image, and try to, like, in addition to looking at the pixels, also try to build like an understanding of the structure of the page, and then being able to determine what changes are like a relevant change versus just rendering differences between computers or between environments.
So it is comparing two images, but it's not doing just a bit.
Exactly, yeah.
That's a proprietary component of your product?
The image processing is a proprietary part. I mean, we have a free plan that runs for like up to a certain amount of validation, so you can start using it for free, but yeah.
Can you use it for like comparing font size?
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, if the font will change. So you have like different levels of comparison that you can use. So the default level will even detect font changes, but you also have ways to just check layout changes. So if you like small font change, you don't care about it because you do it all the time, you can just say, I just want to check the layout. Or if you have a dynamic site, just to give you a quick example, let's say that I want to check like a news website, which might have different content every day. So this is like the Yahoo website. And I checked it on 2 different days, so the content changed, but the layout is exactly the same. So, so when I run the test, in this case, I ran the test in layout mode. When I run the test in layout mode, the test is passing fine because the layout didn't change, only the content changed. If I put it in what we call a strict mode, which will actually look at like all the changes, this will highlight all the content changes, but it doesn't highlight the side menu and the logo and the top menu because this didn't really change. We also have here exact mode, which will do like pixel to pixel matching with thresholds. It's mainly for demonstration. But when I run it in exact mode, this is also an example to see like why I mean, it fails. I don't really see a difference. If I'm going to zoom in like to a really high zoom and toggle, you will see there is a small pixel. Again, it's just rendering differences. Yeah.
So in this entire page, if it was like few of them are in a different font, can we find out that? Like without the baseline.
So, so you mean the content is dynamic, but few of the items are.
The content is static.
Oh yeah, definitely, yeah.
So suppose you have a scenario where you're running campaigns.
Mm-hmm.
So one, and it's going to be different on every page. So one way would be to exclude it.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Can you have like 4 baselines, like one for each campaign?
So this is like one of the features that we're working on is to have like multiple accepted results per page. So it's exactly for this use case. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so again, thank you for taking the time.